The temperature outside the Grand Hotel sits well below freezing, and the frozen surface of the Strömmen Canal catches the thin midwinter light like hammered pewter. Inside a nondescript office 2 streets away, a man named Dushko Popov, codename Tricycle, is preparing to send a message, not to London, to Berlin, and every word of it is a carefully constructed lie. What he is transmitting concerns ball bearings, specifically the imminent disruption of Swedish ball bearing exports to Nazi Germany. A disruption, he explains to his German handlers, caused by British pressure on Stockholm, a pressure that is itself a prelude to something larger, something military, something directed northward, toward Norway. The Germans, starved of reliable intelligence and desperate to hold the Norwegian coastline, believe him. Why would they not? The intelligence is specific, the source is trusted, and the ball bearings, those small, silent, indispensable mechanisms, are, in a sense, absolutely real. This is the story of how British intelligence weaponized an ordinary Swedish factory, turned the mundane logistics of industrial supply into a strategic deception, and convinced the Wehrmacht that an invasion force was massing for Norway at precisely the moment those troops were needed elsewhere entirely. It is a story about the power of small things, small enough to hold in a closed fist, to change the outcome of a war. To understand why ball bearings mattered so much, you need to understand what the war had done to German industry by early 1944. By that point, the conflict had been grinding for nearly 5 years. The Eastern Front was consuming men and materiel at a rate that defied comprehension. Allied bombing raids were hammering German cities, and the Wehrmacht's leadership, while still formidable, was increasingly dependent on a vast, intricate and fragile supply chain that stretched across occupied Europe. At the center of that supply chain sat Sweden. Neutral, prosperous, and commercially pragmatic, Sweden was one of the few European nations still trading openly with both sides. Among its most vital exports was steel, and more particularly precision-engineered ball bearings, produced in enormous quantities by the Svenska Kulliga Fabriken Company, better known as SKF, headquartered in Göteborg. Ball bearings were not glamorous. They were not the stuff of propaganda posters or stirring speeches. But without them, nothing moved. Tanks seized. Aircraft engines failed. Artillery mechanisms locked. A modern military machine required tens of millions of ball bearings each year simply to function. And Germany, through its Swedish trade agreements, was receiving a very large share of SKF's output. By 1943, Allied planners had grasped both the strategic significance of this supply line and its potential as leverage. The United States had already attempted to resolve the problem through force. The Schweinfurt bombing raids of August and October 1943 targeted Germany's domestic ball-bearing production and cost the 8th Air Force catastrophic losses. The raids inflicted real damage on German production capacity, but they did not sever the supply. SKF's Göteborg plants remained untouched. The Swedish tap, as it were, kept running. The question then was not only how to restrict German access to Swedish ball bearings, but how that restriction, real or manufactured, might be turned to a different purpose entirely. The answer emerged from the intersection of two quite different British organisations. The first was the Special Operations Executive, which had spent years cultivating relationships with Swedish industrialists and government officials, carefully probing the limits of Swedish neutrality. The second was the 20 Committee, the body that oversaw Britain's extraordinary network of double agents, operating under the direction of Brigadier John Masterman and Colonel Tommy Robertson of WWII. The 20 Committee's central achievement was something almost improbable. Through a combination of arrests, turned agents, and cryptographic intelligence drawn from Bletchley Park's decryption of German Enigma traffic, British intelligence had, by 1944, effectively captured or controlled every German agent operating in Britain. Messages that the Abwehr, German military intelligence, believed were coming from trusted sources in London were, in reality, being composed in safe houses by WWII officers and transmitted to Hamburg and Berlin under careful supervision. The mechanism was relatively straightforward in principle, though ferociously complex in execution. A turned agent, known as a double agent or XX agent in the system's notation, would continue to communicate with their German controllers via radio or coded correspondence, feeding them a mixture of true but inconsequential information and carefully crafted falsehoods. The true material maintained the agent's credibility. The falsehoods shaped German strategic decisions. Each message had to be calibrated with extraordinary precision. Too much true information and British operational security suffered. Too little, and the Germans grew suspicious. The Abwehr officers receiving these transmissions were not fools. They cross-referenced their sources, looked for inconsistencies, and made assessments of reliability. The 20 Committee's task was to stay ahead of that scrutiny at every turn. For the Norway deception, which would eventually become a component of the larger Operation Fortitude, the strategic effort to mislead Germany about the location and timing of the Allied invasion of Europe. The ball bearings provided precisely the kind of concrete, verifiable adjacent detail that gave a false intelligence picture its weight. Here is how the specific deception worked. By early 1944, British diplomatic pressure on Sweden, combined with American inducements involving post-war trade agreements, was producing a genuine, if gradual, reduction in Swedish ball-bearing exports to Germany. This was real. The Germans knew it. What they did not know was what it meant. Into this uncertainty, the 20 Committee inserted their agents. Tricycle was one of several XX agents who fed the Germans a consistent narrative that British interest in restricting Swedish exports was not merely economic harassment, but preparation, specifically preparation for an amphibious operation against the Norwegian coast. The logic, as presented to German intelligence, ran something like this. Britain was cutting Germany's ball-bearing supply from the south. An invasion of Norway would cut Germany's iron ore supply from the north. Together, the two operations would strangle German heavy industry. The beauty of this construction was that it was internally coherent and rested on facts the Germans could themselves verify. SKF's exports were genuinely declining. There was genuine British interest in Norway. Churchill had, throughout the war, harbored an affection for Scandinavian operations that his American allies found baffling, but that was well known in diplomatic circles. And Germany's dependence on Norwegian iron ore, shipped through Narvik and down the coast, was not a secret. The deception did not ask the Germans to believe something fantastical. It asked them to draw a conclusion that was plausible and wrong. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Supporting the ball-bearing narrative were a range of supplementary operations. Fictitious Scottish-based formations were given radio traffic, paper orders of battle, and invented commanders. Reports were manufactured suggesting the assembly of specialized landing craft at northern ports. Other XX agents confirmed fragments of the picture from different angles, each one a piece of a mosaic that pointed toward Norway, without any single source being asked to carry too much weight. The Germans' response is documented in records that survived the war's end, both in Abwehr files captured by Allied forces and in Wehrmacht operational correspondence that was preserved or surrendered. Throughout the spring and summer of 1944, Hitler maintained substantial forces in Norway that he might otherwise have committed elsewhere. At the peak, estimates suggest that somewhere between 300,000 and 370,000 German troops were garrisoned in the country, a significant fraction of the Wehrmacht's total manpower, held in place against an invasion that was never coming. Soldiers in those garrisons recall the particular frustration of that period, waiting on rocky coastlines, scanning fjords, maintaining equipment against the salt and the damp, watching the Norwegian sky for aircraft that did not come. Every soldier in Norway was a soldier not in France, not in Italy, not on the Eastern Front. Every division held against a fictitious threat was a division unavailable to meet a real one. The records are uneven, as they always are with classified operations, and it is impossible to state with certainty precisely how many German decisions were shaped by the ball-bearing deception specifically, as opposed to the broader Fortitude North operation of which it formed a part. What can be said is that the narrative was consistent, the sources were credible, and the Germans acted upon it. It is worth considering what the Germans were attempting by way of comparison, and why they failed at the same game. The Abwehr ran its own network of agents throughout the war, attempting to penetrate Britain and extract genuine intelligence. What it did not know, and what Bletchley Park's intercepts confirmed, was that this network had been entirely compromised. German agents who believed they were operating freely in Britain were, in almost every case, either imprisoned, executed, or working under British control. The intelligence flowing back to Berlin was exactly what London chose to send. German strategic deception operations during this period were considerably less sophisticated. The Wehrmacht was good at tactical surprise, at operational concealment, at moving units quickly and quietly. But the kind of long-term, systematically managed strategic deception that the 20 Committee practiced, the careful cultivation of trusted fictional sources, the maintenance of a coherent alternative reality over months and years, was beyond them. Partly, this reflected institutional fragmentation. German intelligence was divided between the Abwehr, the SD, the OKWII, and various party bodies, all competing with each other. British intelligence, for all its internal rivalries, had created a unified deception architecture under a single committee, with a single set of control sources and a single strategic narrative. American intelligence, still relatively new to the discipline in the early years of the war, learned quickly from the British model and contributed substantially to Fortitude's supporting structures. But the core architecture, the double agents, the 20 Committee, the disciplined management of what each German handler was permitted to believe, was British in conception and execution. The actual impact of Fortitude North and of the ball-bearing narrative within it remains a subject of careful historical debate. It is difficult and perhaps impossible to isolate any single deception from the broader strategic picture and assign it a precise causal weight. What historians can say is that the German commitment to Norway remained large, remained expensive, and remained essentially wasted throughout the critical period of 1944. The forces garrisoned there played no significant part in resisting the Normandy landings, nor in the subsequent campaign across France and the Low Countries. They sat and waited and watched empty fjords. The legacy of these operations is felt most clearly in the post-war development of intelligence doctrine across Western nations. The discipline of strategic deception, the careful, patient, systematic construction of a false picture using real pieces, became a permanent part of military and intelligence thinking. The techniques refined by the 20 Committee, the management of double agents, the calibration of true and false material, the use of mundane commercial realities as the scaffolding for strategic falsehoods. All of these were studied, documented, and incorporated into the training of intelligence officers for decades after the war ended. Masterman himself published an account of the double-cross system in 1972, confirming what many had long suspected, but which remained officially classified for a generation. Return for a moment to that Stockholm winter, February 1944. A man sitting at a radio set, composing a message about bearings and trade routes and British diplomatic pressure, sending it across the Baltic to handlers who trust him completely. What he is doing, in one sense, is absurdly small. He is telling a story about factory output, about logistics, about the kind of commercial statistics that fill the back pages of trade journals and put most people instantly to sleep. And yet that story, that small, specific, verifiable adjacent story about a factory in Göteborg, is helping to hold 300,000 German soldiers on a cold Norwegian coast, watching for ships that will never come, while elsewhere the war turns against them. That is the lesson the ball-bearing gambit teaches, and it is not really about bearings at all. It is about the nature of intelligence and the nature of belief. The Germans believed because the story was coherent. They believed because the sources were credible. They believed because the story asked them to fear something they already feared, and to confirm something they already suspected. The British did not invent the German anxiety about Norway. They simply found it, shaped it, and fed it. 300,000 soldiers, held in place by a story about a factory. The Wehrmacht had tanks and artillery and coastal fortifications, and a determined will to defend every inch of occupied Europe. Britain had the 20 Committee, a set of carefully managed double agents, and a very clear understanding of what the Germans needed to believe. It turned out that was enough.